The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Windsor Castle as Prince George walked quietly along the stone pathway. At 9 years old, he had grown accustomed to the constant presence of security guards, but today something felt different. The usual chatter and movement around him seemed more subdued than normal. James Morrison had been assigned to Prince George's security detail for 3 years. A former military officer with 15 years of service, he took his duty seriously. Every morning, he would position himself at a respectful distance, watching for any potential threats while allowing the young prince some freedom to explore the castle grounds. James had seen George grow from a curious 6-year-old into a thoughtful boy who often surprised adults with his kindness. On this particular Tuesday morning, Prince George noticed something unusual near the rose garden. An elderly gardener named Thomas was struggling to lift a heavy bag of soil. The man appeared to be in his 70s with weathered hands and a slight tremor that made the task particularly challenging. Thomas had worked at the castle for over 40 years, tending to the gardens that brought joy to countless visitors and royal family members alike. Most people would have simply walked past, perhaps not even noticing the struggling worker. After all, there were protocols about royal family members interacting with staff during their duties. But George stopped in his tracks, his young mind processing what he was seeing. Without hesitation, he approached Thomas with a gentle smile. James watched from his position, initially preparing to redirect the prince away from the situation. Security protocols suggested maintaining distance from working staff, but something about the scene made him pause. He had witnessed many interactions between the royal family and their employees, but this moment felt different somehow. Prince George reached the elderly gardener and politely asked if he needed help. Thomas looked up, startled to see the young prince standing before him. His first instinct was to decline respectfully, as was proper protocol when royalty offered assistance. But there was something in George's earnest expression that touched the old man's heart. The prince didn't wait for permission. He gently took hold of one end of the soil bag, helping Thomas lift it toward the wheelbarrow nearby. The bag was indeed heavy, probably weighing more than George himself, but he persisted with determination. His small hands gripped the rough material as he coordinated with Thomas to move the load safely. James found himself moved by the scene unfolding before him. In his years of military service and royal protection, he had encountered many powerful people. Some were kind, others demanding, but rarely had he witnessed such natural compassion from someone so young. The prince wasn't performing for cameras or following a scripted charitable act. This was simply a child seeing someone in need and responding with genuine care. As they successfully placed the soil bag in the wheelbarrow, Thomas thanked Prince George with obvious emotion in his voice. The elderly gardener explained that his arthritis had been particularly troublesome that morning, making his usual tasks more difficult than normal. George listened intently, asking thoughtful questions about the gardens and showing genuine interest in Thomas's work. The conversation continued for several minutes, with George learning about the different types of roses and when they would bloom. Thomas shared stories about the garden's history, pointing out plants that had been there since before George was born. The prince absorbed every detail, occasionally glancing at colorful butterflies that danced among the flowers. What struck James most profoundly was how naturally the interaction flowed. There was no awkwardness or formality that often characterized royal encounters with staff. George spoke to Thomas as an equal, with respect and curiosity that seemed far beyond his years. The elderly gardener's face lit up as he shared his knowledge with someone who genuinely wanted to learn. Other staff members began to notice the unusual scene. Gardeners working in nearby sections paused their activities, watching with quiet amazement as their colleague chatted comfortably with the young prince. Word began to spread through the castle grounds that something special was happening in the rose garden. James felt his chest tighten with an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. As a security professional, he was trained to remain objective and focused on potential threats. Personal feelings were supposed to be set aside in favor of duty and protocol. But watching Prince George's innocent kindness toward Thomas stirred something deep within him that he couldn't ignore. The guard remembered his own grandfather, who had worked as a janitor in a government building for 30 years. James had often visited him during school breaks, watching how some people treated his grandfather with respect, while others barely acknowledged his existence. Seeing Prince George treat Thomas, with such genuine warmth, reminded James of the person he had once hoped to become before military training and professional obligations had hardened his heart as ill. The conversation between George and Thomas continued. James noticed other details that touched him deeply. The prince had grass stains on his clothes from kneeling to examine some low-growing flowers. His hands were slightly dirty from helping with the soil bag, something that would normally be prevented by protocol. Yet George seemed completely unbothered by these minor inconveniences, focused entirely on connecting with another human being. The morning was becoming warmer, and James could see that both George and Thomas were enjoying their unexpected friendship. The gardener's initial nervousness had completely disappeared, replaced by the comfortable demeanor of someone sharing his passion with an appreciative audience. George asked intelligent questions about plant care and garden maintenance, treating the conversation as seriously as any academic lesson. James realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. In a world where royal interactions were often carefully choreographed and brief, this genuine connection between a young prince and an elderly gardener represented something pure and beautiful. It reminded him why he had originally been drawn to service, before cynicism and routine had begun to cloud his perspective. The scene in the rose garden would have continued peacefully, but James knew that other security personnel and castle staff would soon need to know where Prince George was located. Protocol required regular check-ins and position updates, yet he found himself reluctant to interrupt this precious moment of human connection that was unfolding before him. 20 minutes had passed since Prince George first approached Thomas in the rose garden. What had begun as a simple offer to help had blossomed into a meaningful conversation that captivated both participants. James continued watching from his designated position, growing increasingly aware that this interaction was affecting him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Thomas was now showing George how to properly deadhead roses, explaining the importance of cutting at the right angle to encourage new growth. The prince listened carefully, his small fingers gently following the gardener's instructions. James could see the concentration on George's face as he learned this new skill, treating the lesson with the same seriousness he might give to his regular academic studies. The elderly gardener's eyes sparkled with joy as he shared decades of accumulated knowledge. He told George about the different varieties of roses in the garden, pointing out the deep red blooms that had been planted to commemorate various royal occasions. Some roses had been there since before George's father was born, creating a living timeline of family history that stretched back generations. James found himself learning alongside the prince, despite being positioned several yards away. He had walked through these gardens countless times during his security duties, but had never really noticed the intricate details that Thomas was now revealing. The gardener explained how certain roses required special care during winter months, and how the morning sunlight in this particular section created perfect growing conditions. Prince George asked if he could help with more gardening tasks, and Thomas gladly accepted the offer. Together, they began pulling small weeds from around the base of the rose bushes. George worked carefully, making sure not to disturb the roots of the flowers while removing unwanted plants. His determination to do the job correctly impressed both Thomas and James, who was still observing from a distance. As they worked side by side, Thomas began sharing stories about his long career at the castle. He had started as a young apprentice gardener when he was just 18 years old, learning from master gardeners who had maintained these grounds for decades before him. He described the changes he had witnessed over the years, from new planting techniques to evolving seasonal schedules that accommodated an increasing number of visitors. George was fascinated by these stories, asking questions about what the gardens looked like when his grandparents were children. Thomas painted vivid pictures with his words, describing flower beds that had been redesigned multiple times and trees that had grown from saplings into magnificent specimens. The prince seemed to understand that he was hearing about a living piece of history that connected him to previous generations of his family. James noticed that other castle staff members were beginning to gather at respectful distances, drawn by curiosity about the unusual scene. Housekeepers paused in their rounds, maintenance workers slowed their pace, and even some kitchen staff found reasons to pass by the garden area. Word was spreading that something remarkable was happening between the young prince and the elderly gardener. The growing audience didn't seem to bother either George or Thomas, who remained focused on their gardening collaboration and conversation. If anything, the prince appeared to enjoy sharing what he was learning with the gathering staff members. He would occasionally look up and smile at the watching employees, making them feel included in this special moment rather than excluded by protocol. James felt increasingly conflicted as he watched the scene unfold. His training emphasized the importance of maintaining professional distance and following established security procedures. Yet what he was witnessing challenged everything he thought he knew about duty and service. The genuine connection between George and Thomas represented something valuable that transcended rigid protocols and social hierarchies. The security guard began reflecting on his own relationship with service and responsibility. He had spent years protecting important people, but had he ever really connected with them as human beings? Had his focus on professional obligations caused him to miss opportunities for meaningful interactions that could have enriched both his life and the lives of those he served? Thomas was now teaching George about the importance of proper watering techniques, showing him how to direct water toward the base of plants rather than wetting the leaves unnecessarily. The prince absorbed this information eagerly, practicing the technique under Thomas's patient guidance. Their collaboration had evolved into a natural mentorship that benefited both participants. James realized that Prince George was demonstrating leadership qualities that had nothing to do with his royal title. The boy was showing genuine interest in another person's work and expertise, asking meaningful questions and offering assistance without any expectation of recognition or reward. These qualities suggested a future leader who would understand and value the contributions of all people, regardless of their social position. The morning was progressing, and James knew that other members of the security team would soon be expecting updates on Prince George's location and activities. Protocol required regular communication about the prince's movements and interactions. Yet James felt reluctant to interrupt what was clearly a valuable learning experience for everyone involved. As he considered his next actions, James found himself questioning assumptions he had held throughout his career. Was security really about creating barriers between protected individuals and the world around them? Or could true security sometimes mean facilitating meaningful connections that enriched everyone's understanding and experience? Thomas was now explaining to George how different weather conditions affected plant growth and garden maintenance schedules. The prince listened intently, occasionally offering thoughtful observations that demonstrated his growing understanding of gardening principles. Their conversation had evolved beyond simple instruction into a genuine exchange of ideas and perspectives. The gathering of staff members continued to grow, with people finding various reasons to be in the vicinity of the rose garden. James could see the positive effect that George's interaction with Thomas was having on the entire castle community. Employees who usually worked in isolation were now sharing smiles and quiet conversations. Inspired by the scene they were witnessing, James felt something shifting inside him as he continued to observe this remarkable interaction. The cynicism and emotional distance that had protected him throughout his military and security career were giving way to something warmer and more human. Watching Prince George treat Thomas with such genuine respect and kindness was reminding James of values he had temporarily forgotten in his focus on professional obligations. The afternoon sun was reaching its peak when James received the first radio call from his supervisor. Other security team members were requesting updates on Prince George's current location and activities. Standard protocol required hourly check-ins during outdoor activities, and James had become so absorbed in watching the garden interaction that he had missed his scheduled communication. James pressed the radio button and provided a brief update, reporting that Prince George was safely engaged in educational activities in the rose garden. He deliberately kept his description minimal, uncertain how to explain the profound impact that the scene was having on him personally. His supervisor acknowledged the report and reminded James to maintain regular communication intervals. Meanwhile, Prince George and Thomas had moved to a different section of the garden, where Thomas wanted to show the prince some newly planted seedlings. These young plants represented the next generation of the castle's botanical legacy, and Thomas explained how they would eventually grow into magnificent specimens that future visitors would admire. George was fascinated by this connection between present actions and future beauty. As they walked together, James noticed that Thomas moved with some difficulty due to his age and arthritis. The elderly gardener tried to hide his discomfort, but his pace was slower than usual and he occasionally paused to rest. Prince George seemed to notice this as well, naturally adjusting his own walking speed to match Thomas's comfortable pace without making the older man feel self-conscious about his limitations. When they reached the seedling area, Thomas bent down carefully to examine the young plants. Prince George immediately knelt beside him, bringing himself to the same level as the gardener. This simple gesture of equality struck James powerfully, as he realized that the young prince instinctively understood how to interact with others in ways that preserved dignity and promoted connection. Thomas began explaining how these particular seedlings had been grown from seeds, collected from the garden's oldest and most beautiful plants. This process of renewal ensured that the garden's heritage would continue for many years to come. George listened with obvious fascination, asking thoughtful questions about how long the growing process took and what special care the young plants required. James found himself deeply moved by the conversation he was overhearing. The exchange between George and Thomas represented something timeless and beautiful about human connection across generational lines. The young prince was learning valuable lessons about patience, continuity, and the importance of nurturing things that would benefit future generations. As the afternoon progressed, more staff members continued to gather around the garden area. James noticed that their presence wasn't disrupting the interaction between George and Thomas, but rather creating a supportive community atmosphere. Kitchen staff members were quietly discussing what they were witnessing, and several housekeepers had paused their duties to observe this unusual scene. The growing audience made James more aware of his own role as a witness to something significant. He realized that he wasn't just observing a casual interaction, but rather a moment that revealed important truths about character, kindness, and the potential for meaningful connection across social boundaries. This awareness intensified the emotional impact that the scene was having on him. Prince George was now helping Thomas water the seedlings, carefully following the gardener's instructions about proper technique and water quantity. The prince's concentration and determination to do the task correctly demonstrated a level of respect for the work that went far beyond mere politeness. He genuinely wanted to learn and contribute meaningfully to the garden's care. James reflected on his own relationship with learning and growth. When had he last approached a new skill or knowledge area with the same enthusiasm and respect that Prince George was showing? His military training and security work had focused on efficiency and following established procedures. But had he lost touch with the joy of discovering new perspectives and abilities? Thomas was now teaching George about soil composition and the importance of proper drainage for healthy plant growth. The elderly gardener scooped up a handful of earth, explaining how different types of soil provided various nutrients that plants needed to thrive. George examined the soil sample carefully, asking questions about how gardeners could tell whether soil was healthy and what they could do to improve growing conditions. The depth of the conversation impressed James, who had initially expected the interaction to be brief and superficial. Instead, he was witnessing a genuine educational exchange that was benefiting both participants. Thomas was clearly energized by having such an attentive student, while George was gaining practical knowledge that complemented his formal education in meaningful ways. As James continued observing, he began to understand that this moment was changing him in fundamental ways. The walls he had built around his emotions during years of military service and security work were crumbling as he witnessed the pure humanity of the interaction between George and Thomas. He felt tears forming in his eyes, something that hadn't happened during his professional duties in many years. The sight of Prince George treating Thomas with such genuine respect and curiosity forced James to confront his own assumptions about service and duty. Had he been so focused on protecting people from potential threats that he had forgotten the importance of protecting their capacity for meaningful human connection? Was true security sometimes about facilitating rather than preventing interaction? Thomas was now showing George how to identify signs of plant diseases and pest problems that could threaten garden health. The elderly gardener explained that early detection was crucial for protecting entire plant communities, and that careful observation was one of the most important skills a gardener could develop. George listened intently, clearly understanding that these lessons applied to much more than just plant care. James realized that he was learning alongside Prince George, gaining insights that challenged his professional worldview. The conversation between the prince and Thomas was revealing the importance of attention, care, and proactive nurturing in any relationship or responsibility. These principles applied as much to security work as they did to gardening, but James had never considered them from this perspective. The afternoon light was beginning to shift, creating beautiful patterns among the garden plants and highlighting the peaceful scene between George and Thomas. James knew that this interaction would need to end eventually, as the prince had other scheduled activities and responsibilities. But he found himself hoping that the moment could continue indefinitely, allowing him to process the emotional and philosophical impact it was having on him. As he watched Prince George carefully examine a flower under Thomas's guidance, James felt something fundamental shifting in his understanding of what it meant to serve and protect others. The young prince was demonstrating that true leadership involved genuine interest in other people's experiences and contributions, regardless of their social position or formal status. The radio crackled again with another routine check from security headquarters. James acknowledged the call mechanically, but his mind was far from standard procedures. He had been watching Prince George and Thomas for over 2 hours now, and the interaction had evolved into something that challenged everything he thought he understood about his role and purpose. Thomas was now sharing stories about the wildlife that visited the gardens regularly. He pointed out various bird nesting areas and explained how the garden's design created habitats that supported local ecosystem health. Prince George was fascinated by these connections between human planning and natural wildlife, asking thoughtful questions about how gardeners could help protect vulnerable species. James found himself remembering his childhood dreams of becoming a park ranger or wildlife conservationist. Those aspirations had been set aside when he chose military service, then security work. But watching the conversation between George and Thomas was reawakening interests and values he had buried under professional obligations. When had he stopped noticing the beauty and complexity of the natural world around him? The growing crowd of castle staff members had organized themselves into a respectful semicircle around the garden area, where George and Thomas were working. James could see the positive energy radiating from the group as they witnessed this unusual interaction. Conversations were happening in hushed tones, with staff members sharing their own observations and reactions to what they were seeing. A senior housekeeper named Margaret approached James's position, speaking quietly so as not to disturb the garden conversation. She mentioned that she had worked at the castle for 25 years and had never seen anything quite like this interaction between a royal family member and a staff worker. Her eyes were bright with emotion as she described how the scene was affecting everyone who witnessed it. Margaret explained that Thomas had been struggling recently with feelings of invisibility and unimportance as he aged. His arthritis made physical tasks more difficult, and he had begun to worry that his decades of service to the castle gardens were no longer valued. Seeing Prince George treat him with such genuine respect and interest was transforming Thomas's sense of self-worth in real time. James listened to Margaret's insights while continuing to observe the ongoing interaction between George and Thomas. He could see the truth of her observations in Thomas's increasingly confident posture and animated gestures as he shared his knowledge with the young prince. The elderly gardener was literally glowing with renewed purpose and pride in his work. This revelation deepened the emotional impact that the scene was having on James. He realized that he was witnessing not just a kind gesture, but a life-changing moment for Thomas. Prince George's simple decision to offer help and show genuine interest was restoring dignity and value to someone who had begun to feel forgotten and irrelevant. James began thinking about other elderly staff members throughout the castle who might be experiencing similar feelings of diminished importance. How many valuable people were struggling with loneliness and self-doubt, while surrounded by others who simply didn't take time to notice their contributions and humanity? The thought troubled him deeply. Prince George was now helping Thomas collect fallen leaves that had accumulated around the base of some rose bushes. The task was simple but necessary for maintaining garden health, and the prince approached it with the same careful attention he had given to all the previous activities. Thomas explained how decomposing leaves could be composted to create nutrient-rich soil for future planting projects. The conversation had evolved into a comprehensive education about sustainable gardening practices and environmental stewardship. James realized that Prince George was receiving valuable lessons that would never appear in formal textbooks, but would shape his understanding of responsibility, and connection to the natural world. These insights would likely influence his future decisions and leadership approach in ways that traditional education could never achieve. As James continued watching, he became increasingly aware of his own emotional state. The protective barriers he had maintained throughout his military and security career were completely dissolved. He felt vulnerable and exposed in ways that both frightened and liberated him. When had he last allowed himself to be so moved by human connection and kindness? Thomas was now showing Prince George a small injured bird that had been found in the garden earlier that morning. The elderly gardener had created a temporary shelter for the creature and was caring for it until wildlife rehabilitation specialists could arrive. George examined the bird with gentle concern, asking questions about its condition and what could be done to help it recover. The sight of Prince George carefully observing the injured bird while listening to Thomas's explanation of wildlife care protocols moved James profoundly. The young prince was learning lessons about compassion and responsibility that went far beyond formal duty obligations. He was developing an understanding of service that encompassed all living creatures, not just human relationships. James found himself questioning the narrow focus of his own service approach. Had he been so concerned with protecting Prince George from potential human threats that he had forgotten about the importance of connection with the broader world? Was true security about creating opportunities for growth and understanding, rather than simply preventing negative experiences? The afternoon was advancing, and James knew that other scheduled activities would soon require Prince George's attention. Yet he felt reluctant to interrupt this valuable learning experience that was clearly benefiting everyone involved. The prince was gaining practical knowledge and developing emotional intelligence that would serve him well throughout his life. Margaret approached James again, this time to share her observation that the entire castle staff seemed energized by what they were witnessing. People who usually worked in isolation were finding reasons to collaborate and share stories inspired by the scene in the rose garden. The positive effects of Prince George's interaction with Thomas were rippling throughout the entire community. This broader impact made James realize that he was witnessing something with implications far beyond the immediate participants. The scene was demonstrating the power of genuine human connection to transform entire communities and organizational cultures. One simple act of kindness and respect was creating waves of positive change that touched dozens of people. Thomas was now teaching Prince George how to properly prune damaged stems from rose bushes, explaining the importance of making clean cuts that would promote healthy regrowth. The prince practiced the technique carefully under Thomas's patient guidance, taking pride in learning a skill that would contribute to the garden's long-term health and beauty. James watched as Prince George's small hands worked alongside Thomas's weathered ones, both focused on the same goal of nurturing life and promoting growth. The image struck him as a perfect metaphor for intergenerational collaboration and the passing of wisdom from experienced practitioners to eager learners. This was education in its purest and most meaningful form. The radio call that changed everything came at 3:47 in the afternoon. James's supervisor, Commander Harrison, was requesting immediate confirmation of Prince George's location and activities for a security briefing with senior palace officials. The tone was more urgent than usual, and James could sense that his delayed responses to earlier check-ins had raised concerns about protocol compliance. James looked across the garden where Prince George and Thomas were now, working together to transplant small seedlings into a new flower bed. The prince was carefully following Thomas's instructions, making sure each plant had adequate space and proper soil coverage. Their collaboration had become so natural that they moved together like experienced partners, anticipating each other's needs and sharing tools without discussion. When James radioed back with his location report, Commander Harrison's response was sharp and immediate. A security team was being dispatched to the Rose Garden for immediate escort of Prince George to his next scheduled appointment. The command came with an implicit criticism of James's extended observation period and failure to maintain stricter time management of the prince's activities. The news hit James like a physical blow. He realized that his decision to allow the garden interaction to continue had violated multiple security protocols and could result in serious professional consequences. More importantly, he understood that the arrival of additional security personnel would abruptly end the meaningful connection that had developed between Prince George and Thomas. James watched as Thomas showed the prince how to create small wells around each transplanted seedling to help retain water during dry periods. George listened intently, asking questions about seasonal watering schedules and how gardeners managed plant care during extreme weather conditions. The conversation was rich with practical wisdom that the prince was absorbing eagerly. The approaching sound of footsteps on gravel paths announced the arrival of the security escort team. James could see Commander Harrison leading 2 other guards toward the rose garden, their body language indicating official business that would not be delayed or negotiated. The moment of reckoning that James had been dreading was finally arriving. Thomas must have sensed the change in atmosphere because he looked up from the seedling transplantation with a slightly worried expression. Prince George followed his gaze and noticed the approaching security personnel, but didn't seem particularly concerned about their arrival. The prince had grown accustomed to scheduled changes and official interruptions throughout his young life. James felt his heart racing as he realized that he was about to face questions about his handling of the afternoon's activities. How could he explain that he had become so emotionally invested in the interaction between Prince George and Thomas that he had lost track of professional obligations? Would his superiors understand the profound impact that the scene had on him personally? Commander Harrison reached James's position and began speaking in low tones about schedule adherence and protocol compliance. James listened to the criticism while keeping one eye on Prince George, who was now helping Thomas clean their gardening tools and organize them for storage. Even in these final moments together, the prince was demonstrating the same careful attention and respect that had characterized their entire interaction. The sight of Prince George taking such care with simple gardening tools while preparing to leave his new friend struck James as unbearably poignant. The young prince seemed to understand that this special time was ending, but he was determined to complete their shared tasks properly rather than rushing away without consideration for Thomas's needs. Thomas was explaining to Prince George how different tools required specific cleaning and storage procedures to maintain their effectiveness and longevity. The elderly gardener's voice carried a note of sadness as he realized that their time together was drawing to a close. Yet he continued teaching until the very end, sharing knowledge that might prove useful. If the prince ever had future opportunities for gardening activities, James found himself fighting back tears as he listened to Commander Harrison's stern reminders about professional responsibilities and security priorities. The criticism was justified according to established protocols, but James felt that his superiors were missing something crucial about what had transpired in the rose garden. This hadn't been a security failure, but rather a profound success in human connection and educational value. Prince George was now thanking Thomas for the gardening lessons and expressing genuine appreciation for everything he had learned. The sincerity in the young prince's voice was unmistakable, and Thomas responded with obvious emotion as he described how much he had enjoyed sharing his knowledge with such an interested student. Their farewell was touching in its mutual respect and warmth. As the security escort prepared to take Prince George to his next appointment, James realized that he was facing a fundamental choice about his future. He could accept the criticism, return to standard protocol compliance, and continue his security career as if this afternoon had never happened. Or he could acknowledge that the experience had changed him in ways that made it impossible to return to his previous approach to duty and service. The decision crystallized in James's mind as he watched Prince George wave goodbye to Thomas and the gathered staff members who had witnessed their interaction. The young prince's natural grace and genuine warmth in these final moments confirmed everything that James had observed throughout the afternoon. This was a future leader who understood the importance of human connection and mutual respect across all social boundaries. Thomas stood alone in the rose garden as Prince George departed with his security escort, but his posture radiated satisfaction and renewed energy rather than disappointment. The elderly gardener began organizing his tools and planning future garden projects with obvious enthusiasm. The afternoon's interaction had restored his sense of purpose and value in ways that would last far beyond the immediate experience. James remained in position as required, but his mind was racing with the implications of what he had witnessed and experienced. The profound emotional impact of watching Prince George interact with Thomas had awakened values and priorities that he had suppressed during years of military and security service. He could no longer ignore the disconnect between his professional obligations, and his personal convictions about what constituted meaningful service. Commander Harrison was now directing James to complete a detailed incident report about the afternoon's activities and explain his decisions regarding schedule management and protocol adherence. The paperwork and formal review process would likely result in disciplinary action or reassignment to less sensitive duties. James understood these potential consequences, but found that he no longer cared about protecting his career advancement. As he walked away from the rose garden, James carried with him a crystal-clear understanding of what he needed to do next. The choice between professional security and personal integrity was no longer difficult or complicated. Prince George's gentle kindness toward Thomas had shown James what true service looked like, and he could no longer participate in a system that prioritized rigid protocols over human connection and genuine care. The afternoon sun was beginning to set as James prepared to make the most important decision of his professional life. The image of Prince George and Thomas working together in the garden would remain with him forever, serving as a reminder of what was possible when people chose kindness and respect over convention and hierarchy. That evening, James sat in his small apartment reviewing the incident report he was required to submit about the afternoon's events. The official language felt cold and inadequate as he tried to describe what had actually transpired in the rose garden. How could formal documentation capture the profound human connection he had witnessed between Prince George and Thomas, or explain the transformative impact it had on everyone present? James had spent 3 hours attempting to write a report that satisfied protocol requirements while remaining truthful about his observations and decisions. Every sentence felt like a betrayal of the beautiful experience he had witnessed. The bureaucratic language reduced Prince George's genuine kindness to a simple interaction with castle staff and dismissed Thomas's wisdom and dignity as merely grounds maintenance activities, unable to complete the sanitized version that his superiors expected. James began writing a different kind of report. He described in detail what he had observed, including his own emotional responses and the broader impact on castle staff members. He wrote about Prince George's natural leadership qualities and the valuable lessons the young prince had learned from Thomas's patient teaching. The honest report grew to 12 pages as James found himself documenting not just the afternoon's events, but also his evolving understanding of what security and service should really mean. He wrote about the importance of protecting people's capacity for meaningful connection, rather than simply shielding them from potential threats. He described how Prince George's interaction with Thomas had enhanced rather than compromised the prince's safety and development. As James wrote, he realized that he was essentially submitting his resignation along with the incident report. No security organization would accept his philosophical conclusions about the limitations of rigid protocol enforcement. His superiors would view his emotional investment in the afternoon's events as evidence of professional unsuitability rather than personal growth and awakening. The thought of leaving his security career initially frightened James, but as he continued writing, he felt increasingly liberated by the prospect of change. The afternoon in the rose garden had reminded him of values and priorities that he had abandoned during years of military and security service. Perhaps it was time to explore opportunities that aligned better with his rediscovered sense of purpose. James remembered conversations with Thomas during the garden interaction, particularly the elderly man's stories about finding meaning and satisfaction in nurturing growth and creating beauty. Thomas had worked at the castle for 40 years, but his job satisfaction came from the positive impact of his daily activities rather than career advancement or professional recognition. Perhaps there were lessons in Thomas's approach to work and life that James could apply to his own situation. The next morning, James dressed in his security uniform for what he suspected might be the final time. He had completed his honest incident report and was prepared to face whatever consequences resulted from his deviation from standard protocols. The experience in the Rose Garden had shown him that some things were more important than career security or professional advancement. Commander Harrison called James into his office at 9 o'clock sharp. The commander's expression was stern as he reviewed the incident report, occasionally glancing up at James with obvious displeasure. The criticism was swift and comprehensive, covering everything from schedule management to appropriate boundaries between royal family members and staff personnel. James listened to the disciplinary lecture without attempting to defend his decisions or minimize his protocol violations. He understood that his superiors were operating within established systems designed to protect royal family members from potential security threats. However, he also understood that those same systems sometimes prevented the meaningful human connections that could enrich everyone's experience. When Commander Harrison finished his formal criticism, he asked James to explain his thinking during the previous afternoon's events. This was the moment James had been preparing for during his sleepless night of report writing and soul-searching. He spoke honestly about what he had witnessed and why it had affected him so profoundly. James described Prince George's natural kindness and genuine interest in Thomas's knowledge and experience. He explained how the interaction had demonstrated leadership qualities that went far beyond formal training or protocol compliance. He talked about the positive impact on castle staff members who had witnessed the scene, and how it had created a sense of community and shared purpose that lasted long after the prince had departed. Commander Harrison listened to James's explanation with growing confusion and concern. The security chief clearly couldn't understand how a trained professional could become so emotionally invested in what should have been a routine day of protective duty. From his perspective, James had allowed personal feelings to compromise professional judgment in ways that could have created security vulnerabilities. James realized that he and his supervisor were operating from fundamentally different understandings of what constituted effective service and protection. Commander Harrison saw security in terms of threat prevention and protocol compliance, while James had come to understand it as facilitating opportunities for growth, connection, and meaningful experience. These perspectives were incompatible within the current organizational structure. When the disciplinary meeting concluded, James was given 24 hours to submit a plan for improved protocol compliance and professional development. The implication was clear. He could either recommit to standard security procedures or face reassignment to less sensitive duties. For most people in his position, this would have been a straightforward choice in favor of career preservation. James spent that afternoon walking through the castle grounds, revisiting the rose garden where his transformation had begun. Thomas was there, working with obvious energy and enthusiasm as he tended to the plants he and Prince George had transplanted together the previous day. The elderly gardener's renewed sense of purpose was evident in his confident movements and careful attention to detail. Thomas noticed James approaching and greeted him warmly, expressing gratitude for allowing the extended interaction with Prince George to continue. The elderly man described how the experience had reminded him of the value and importance of his work in ways that had reinvigorated his enthusiasm for gardening. He felt seen and appreciated in ways that had been missing from his recent experience. The conversation with Thomas confirmed James's growing conviction that he had made the right choice in allowing the garden interaction to continue, regardless of protocol violations. Sometimes the most important security decisions involve protecting people's capacity for meaningful connection, rather than simply following established procedures. Prince George had been safer and more enriched by his time with Thomas than he would have been in any sterile, protocol-compliant environment. As James prepared to submit his response to Commander Harrison's ultimatum, he felt a sense of peace about the difficult choice he was making. The afternoon in the rose garden had awakened values and priorities that he could no longer ignore or suppress. His resignation would be painful in some ways, but it would also represent a return to authentic service aligned with his deepest convictions about human dignity and connection. James submitted his resignation letter at exactly 9 o'clock the following morning. The document was brief but honest, explaining that he had come to understand service and protection in ways that were incompatible with current security protocols. He thanked his superiors for the opportunity to serve and expressed hope that future policies might better balance safety requirements with opportunities for meaningful human connection. Commander Harrison accepted the resignation with obvious relief, clearly viewing James's departure as the best solution to an uncomfortable situation. There was no attempt to persuade him to reconsider or discussion of alternative arrangements. The security chief seemed eager to move past the incident and return to standard operational procedures with a replacement guard who would be less likely to allow emotional considerations to influence professional decisions. The administrative process of leaving his security position took 3 days to complete. During this time, James found himself returning repeatedly to the rose garden, where he often encountered Thomas working among the plants that had become symbols of transformation and renewed purpose. Their conversations deepened as James shared his decision to leave security work and explore opportunities that aligned better with his evolving understanding of service. Thomas listened to James's plans with understanding and encouragement, sharing his own experiences of career transitions and the importance of following authentic convictions, even when they led to uncertain outcomes. The elderly gardener had made several significant changes throughout his 40-year career, always prioritizing meaningful work over financial security or social status. His example provided James with valuable perspective on the courage required for authentic living. On his final day at the castle, James received an unexpected message requesting his presence at a brief meeting with senior staff members. He assumed this would be a routine exit interview or final briefing about confidentiality obligations. Instead, he found himself in a room with several people who had witnessed the interaction between Prince George and Thomas in the rose garden. Margaret, the senior housekeeper, spoke first about the positive impact that James's decision had on the entire castle community. She explained how the garden scene had inspired conversations about dignity, respect, and the value of every person's contributions regardless of their official position. Staff members were treating each other with increased kindness and consideration, creating a more positive work environment for everyone. Other staff members shared similar observations about the lasting effects of Prince George's interaction with Thomas. Kitchen workers described how they had begun taking more interest in each other's expertise and experiences. Maintenance personnel were collaborating more effectively and sharing knowledge across traditional departmental boundaries. The security incident had paradoxically created greater actual security through enhanced community cohesion and mutual support. James listened to these reports with amazement and growing understanding of the broader implications of his decision. He had focused primarily on the immediate impact on Prince George and Thomas, but the ripple effects had touched dozens of people throughout the castle community. One afternoon of allowed human connection had created positive changes that continued expanding days later. The staff meeting concluded with an unexpected proposal. Several senior employees had approached castle administration about creating a new position focused on community liaison and staff development. This role would involve facilitating positive interactions between different departments and ensuring that valuable knowledge and experience were shared effectively throughout the organization. They wanted to offer this position to James. The job offer represented an opportunity to remain at the castle while pursuing work that aligned with his newfound understanding of meaningful service. James would be responsible for creating programs that promoted dignity, respect, and genuine connection among staff members. The position would also involve developing protocols for royal family interactions that balanced security requirements with opportunities for authentic human connection. James accepted the offer immediately, recognizing it as an unexpected opportunity to transform his painful departure into a positive new beginning. The role would allow him to apply lessons learned from the Rose Garden incident while contributing to positive organizational change. He would be able to work alongside people like Thomas and Margaret, who shared his commitment to treating every person with dignity and respect. 6 months later, James stood in the same rose garden where his transformation had begun, now serving as community liaison coordinator for the castle staff. The programs he had developed were thriving, creating opportunities for knowledge sharing and mutual support that had dramatically improved morale and job satisfaction throughout the organization. Staff members were more engaged, collaborative, and committed to their work than ever before. Thomas had become James's closest collaborator and advisor, sharing decades of wisdom about building positive relationships and maintaining community cohesion. The elderly gardener's energy and enthusiasm continued to inspire everyone around him, particularly after his meaningful interaction with Prince George had reminded him of his own value and importance to the castle community. Prince George occasionally visited the rose garden during his outdoor activities, always greeting Thomas warmly and inquiring about the plants they had worked on together. These brief interactions maintained the connection that had started their transformation, while respecting appropriate boundaries and security protocols. The prince's genuine interest in Thomas's work continued to energize the elderly gardener and inspire other staff members. James often reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought him from rigid security protocols to meaningful community service. The afternoon in the Rose Garden had awakened values and priorities that he hadn't realized were missing from his life. Prince George's simple act of kindness toward Thomas had demonstrated the power of authentic human connection to transform individuals and entire communities. The incident report that had initially threatened James's career had eventually become the foundation for positive organizational change that benefited everyone involved. His honest documentation of the garden interaction had provided evidence for the value of balancing security requirements with opportunities for meaningful connection. The castle had become a model for other royal residences seeking to improve staff satisfaction and community cohesion. As James watched Thomas teaching a group of young apprentice gardeners the same lessons he had shared with Prince George, he felt profound gratitude for the unexpected path that had led him to truly meaningful work. The Rose Garden continued to bloom with flowers that represented growth, beauty, and the enduring power of genuine human connection to create positive change in the world.